Hello there, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan, and Maul Shadow Lords is out. At least the first two episodes are, and I gotta say, the Star Wars animated stuff is still hitting on all cylinders, I think. With Dave Filoni stepping up into the president and chief creative officer position at Lucasfilm, it's clear that animation will remain important for Star Wars in the coming years, especially with Disney shifting from the streaming wars era of overproducing expensive content that didn't always work out to something that is more budget friendly. Historically animated shows like Maul Shadow Lords cost the studio only around $1 to $2 million per episode versus live action shows like Andor that cost over $25 million per episode. $25 million is probably what this entire Maul animated series costs. So, Disney's always been behind Netflix and Warner Brothers when it comes to cost efficiency on making their shows and content. And I think that is especially important now that we are fully in the streaming era. Maul Shadow Lords continues the trend of Lucasfilm really improving the visuals of their animated content. We've gone a long way since those early episodes of the Clone Wars, which George Lucas actually pumped a ton of money into. At those times, the Clone Wars was considered like Lucasfilm's biggest financial loser. They just were not making enough money compared to the amount of money that George Lucas was putting into the series himself. Lucas really wanted to push digital animation technology, and he saw it as the next big thing, and it also conveniently helped him tell the stories that really filled the gaps in between his movies, arguably making the prequels far richer and enjoyable. And I think right now, because Lucasfilm Star Wars is a bit aimless because of a lack of a strong, executive leadership, or at least creative leadership, it kind of makes sense that they're going back into the animated stuff because, again, lower risk, lower cost, and you can do a lot of interesting things, which I think they definitely nailed with the premise of the show. It also should be noted, the Clone Wars was a pretty groundbreaking animated series outside of Star Wars. Lucas's team developed new techniques for wind, water, and character movement. The man was always an innovator. It wasn't always just about making money, although he liked making money. It wasn't even always about telling stories. Lucas loved the actual act of production, I think, a lot. Now, while there have been a lot of big improvements with animated content in Star Wars, I think the biggest leap is really lighting. Just like in gaming, lighting has been the biggest change in the last decade in a lot of this digital artwork we see. And given Maul Shadow Lord's very gloomy and dark kind of ambiance, lighting becomes especially important because low light scenes are always amongst the hardest to properly portray on screen accurately. You want to make it dark so there's that vibe, but you also want audiences to understand what's going on. You need to create separation and depth with a very limited amount of variation in color and contrast. And this is where Maul Shadow Lords kind of excels. They do an excellent job at not making everything look completely dark and washed out like the last season of the Game of Thrones, like when winter comes. This is not easy. Now, I think Maul Shadow Lords also has some other aesthetic choices that are also interesting and unique, but they kind of fall flat for me personally. The use of almost impressionist still paintings in the background on a world like Gen X really just doesn't work for me. I understand that this is probably a callback to the original Star Wars movies that use large murals in the background instead of CGI or real sets because of limitations to the budget. But when you apply this kind of technique to a digital animation, it kind of feels gimmicky. I think Filoni sometimes suffers from just member berries a little too much, right? He really loves calling back to things, and I think it hurts the content. It definitely hurts the visuals, in my opinion. Because the world of Gen X is almost Coruscant, it's a Seminopolis with almost infinite buildings and dirt creeks stretching in every direction. This is the one place where CGI really excels, because you can have just a lot of detail and immersion that you wouldn't be able to create otherwise. We could have seen some real next level visual world building here. Instead, my first impression of the show was that my internet buffering was messed up on Disney Plus, and everything was just being rendered in low quality because my internet sucks or something like that. Or I was playing some video game with NVIDIA's upscaler turned on too high, so everything's a little blurry and not very clear. Ultimately, the static backgrounds in a lot of these scenes robbed the city of its vibrance and made it feel eerily empty. And I get maybe that's what they're going for, a Gotham, a crime-ridden, almost apocalyptic city that's falling apart albeit with more like Blade Runner kind of color palette. But still, it really doesn't work for me. It just kind of cheapens the visuals. On the other hand, the character models, the rendering of Maul and Lawson, the crime lords, Lottie Vario and Nicodemus, are all done superbly, showing us again just how far we've gone since those early days in the Clone Wars. One of the bigger problems with, I think, the Clone Wars series specifically was just how copy and paste all the henchmen in each faction looked. And I think this was to save, obviously, on the animation budget, but it tended to make scenes look very, I think, boring and flat. The griminess and dark lighting of this show definitely hides the uniform nature of each faction in Maul Shadow Lords, whether it's the Gen X police or Maul's gang. It's not to say that the design of these characters are more unique, but the theme of the show, Shadows, definitely helps hide the imperfections and replications, which again is one of the big bonuses of having low light environments. But yeah, they did a great job with that. Overall, I would say Maul Shadow Lords is not a huge jump in visuals compared to previous shows like, The Bad Batch or the 7th season of the Clone Wars, but it does everything pretty good. But the first 20 minutes of this show made me feel like I was watching a Star Wars movie, which, means it's a lot more epic than your average TV show really feels. And I think the music really had a big role to play in making the scene feel, a lot more consequential and important. In truth, though, this is really just a side story of a side character, right? Which is a lot of Star Wars content nowadays. Darth Maul went from a silent character in the prequels to having his own very interesting storyline, all thanks to George Lucas and Dave Filoni. And in a world where there's, no tier 1 Jedi or Sith, Maul is very much a menace, from his first appearance during that heist to that tunnel fight scene with the Pikes, which has almost become an obligatory dark side Force user fighting scene since Darth Vader did it in Rogue One. Sam Witwer brings back Maul as the voice actor here, and he does an excellent job. I have to say that this Maul is definitely a little more mature, a little more subdued. Like, he feels the oppression of the Empire pretty hard. And so you don't get to see the full range of Witwer yet, but I'm sure he's going to throw in some crazy screams, maybe one or two Kenobis, one of the fan favorites. But yeah, the theme of oppression is really everywhere. Even Darth Maul's ragtag crew seems duller. The Death Watch have lost their trademark red armor, and Root Cast has seemingly lost their trademark purple hair. I guess dye treatments are harder when you're a fugitive on the run. Or maybe there just isn't enough light in any of these scenes to see what the true color of her hair is. But her armor definitely looks a lot worse for wear as well. This period of galactic history right after the fall of the Republic is something we seldom see on screen, so I'm excited to see kind of the world-building aspects of this show. And I think really the oppressed and worn nature of what we're seeing on a world like Gen X says a lot more than even the appearance of a Star Destroyer about the effects of the Empire, which is good because we actually don't see any Imperials, any sign of the Empire for at least the first 2 episodes. There is some talk about them in the same way that Chief Hines in Andor talks about the Empire as some, supervisor on another planet that they don't want to get involved in local kind of activities. So I think they're also going to be following that kind of storytelling element where we start off really small and localized and we expand as the story gets larger. The Jedi pairing is also interesting. First, we have Master Eek Diodaki, who surprisingly is a Trandoshan, which kind of shatters all my admittedly specious views of lizard aliens. I know there was like a Trandoshan in the High Republic era, but he was like more Trandoshan, a little more. But yeah, Master Daki is very much cut in the cloth of a late Republic period Jedi, principle antiquated, and given this is Maul's story, a symbol of why the Jedi have failed. We'll be doing another video about just how important this character is in relation to Maul, because it seems like both he and the Trandoshan Jedi Master will be fighting over his apprentice, the Twilight Padawan, Devin Azara, who we know relatively little about, except for the fact that she did survive Order 66, which means that she has either great skill or great luck. Both are very important for a Jedi to survive post-Order 66. The third faction is the Gen X security forces. They're represented by the lawman Lawson and his sidekick Two Boots, who proves that droids will always be amongst the most favorite characters made by Lucasfilm. Actually, these two remind me a bit of like CoffeeZilla and his robot bartender who serves him the coffee all the time. But yeah, I mean, as far as lawman goes, this is pretty stereotypical. He is the one kind of honest lawman in a mid-worm world which is overrun by criminals, right? So this is your more pragmatic style of lawkeeper who has to balance public safety with also the safety of his own men and limitations of his police force as far as how much he can crack down on the crime lords. He seems to have a pretty good relationship with a lot of these guys. So he's not quite the honest cop we see in the Cad Bane origin story, Tales of the Underworld. But you can definitely see that Filoni was testing some ideas with those sequences in the earlier series. Now, personally, I'm excited to see where Lawson heads as far as character development goes. He's really the only hero or moral character in this anti-hero series, and he's really vulnerable, when compared to Maul's typical lightsaber-wielding opponents. And Lawson has already been knocked out pretty quickly in one of the sequences. It was almost like an afterthought. And so if you're wondering if you should watch this show or not and get Disney Plus for a show like this, well, I'd have to say that Dave Filoni has basically perfected this kind of animation formula. And if you like previous shows, you'll probably like this as well. If you found those earlier shows to be too simplistic or just not that interesting, you might want to skip this. Although I do have to say that Maul is really a tier 1 character in my opinion. He's very interesting, and I think there are a lot of interesting things they can do with this series. The Star Wars animated series do seem simple on the surface, and that's because they have to cater to younger audiences, and that can limit the appeal of these shows sometimes to older viewers. For instance, a lot of these factions, they only have 2 characters that you really have to know. All the other henchmen, again, are the same. They don't even have names oftentimes. So there's very few characters that you actually have to pay attention to, which creates a more simplified and quicker view experience. But less is not always a bad thing. Sometimes less is more. I mean, there is definitely talent in being able to wield a really good story in a short form, right? As long as your themes are strong. It's really not fair to compare Maul Shadow Lords to a show like Andor or even any of the other live-action TV series. If we take a look back at the Clone Wars and Rebels animated Star Wars shows, those shows were also called very simplistic. And there were definitely filler episodes in some of those larger shows. But again, thematically and from a lore point of view, these shows did a lot of heavy lifting. Twin Sons featuring Maul and Obi-Wan Kenobi's final confrontation was terrific. The Clone Wars made young fans realize just how cruel the Republic's war against the Separatists was, better than any of the prequel films did. And I think Maul Shadow Lords will finally let us explore a very interesting side of Maul's psyche, which we'll get into more details in our next video, and that is this deep longing and hunger he has inside of him. I mean, yes, this show will be about revenge. We will see awesome sword fights, violence, and darkness. But the reason why Maul acts like this wounded animal is probably the thing that interests me the most. And his interactions with that young Twilight Jedi, I think, are really interesting. And it'll show us another side of him that was kind of first explored in the Rebels series when he first tries to seduce Ezra, and later in the Clone Wars last season where he also tries to do the same with Ahsoka. I believe that Maul Shadow Lords will ask us a very interesting question. With the Galactic Empire now in charge of the galaxy, what exactly do the values of the Jedi Order mean anymore? How pragmatic can one get in order to survive? How low are you willing to dip in order to defeat a greater enemy like Emperor Palpatine? This is Andor level complexity and moral grayness, I think, and this is the direction I believe Star Wars needs to go. Not because black and white narratives are, antiquated or anything like that, but I think you do give more value to the viewer when you force them to think and just not paint everything as good and evil. And Maul is really kind of the perfect character to do that, because he's a horrible person. At the same time, if you know the backstory of the Shadow Collective and, the Crimson Dawn, he actually mounts one of the best attempts against the Empire pretty early on. Anyway, guys, stick around for more content about Maul Shadow Lords, and don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our content. I'll see you next time.